everybody, I'm James Hester. Welcome back to the School of Mars. Now, over the 3 years of doing my PhD research, I encountered loads of rabbit holes that at the time I didn't have the chance to tumble down as far as I wanted. All these different bits and pieces of information and intriguing things that I really wanted to examine in much more detail, but at the time I was constrained by time limits, resources, so I had to put them aside as something that I'd eventually come back to and dig into a bit more deeper. So today I want to talk about one of those things that I encountered in the course of this research. And to start, I want to share with you the story that started all of this. So I was at one of the arms collections that I was visiting for my research. I won't name names. And it was one where the timing of my being there was just after there had been a major exhibition that had closed. So a lot of the objects that I was interested in looking at just happened to be off display and in stores laid out before they went back into their regular cases or put away. So it was the golden opportunity to just kind of dig in where everything was laid out to do my work much more efficiently. So while I was there doing my initial spot check of the objects, the curator pulled me aside and said, have a look at this piece as well. It won't be relevant to your research, but it's not off display very often, and it's just a cool piece. Have a look at this. And he hands me a very famous ceremonial sword. Now, for those who may not know, ceremonial swords is a term to describe a class of sword that is generally quite elaborately decorated. This is not a weapon that is intended to be used in actual fighting. It's purely a symbolic tool, sometimes to represent the authority of a particular office or of a particular person. So these are usually carried in processions or at various official functions as a symbol of power. So he hands me this beautiful ceremonial sword, which is quite well known. And because I was on autopilot, it had been so many different collections up to that point, I immediately looked to the blade for signs of damage. It was just a reflex at that point. And lo and behold, I found a bunch of nicks and dings and other things that were completely in line with a lot of the other functional weapons that I had examined so far. So it made me stop and question and ask the curator, are you absolutely certain that this had never seen a working life at any point? So far as he was aware, it hadn't. So I ended up adding this sword to the list of objects that I was set to examine during that visit. And as a result, for every collection that I visited afterwards, I would make a point of examining any ceremonial swords that they had to see if I would encounter similar things. And sure enough, on a number of occasions, I did. So it raised this whole area of investigation that I wanted eventually to revisit, which is what's going on with these allegedly purely ceremonial swords having damage to their blades that's consistent with the much more practical business-like weapons that I had been examining. What possible explanations could there be to account for this? I'll say right now that this video is going to ask more questions than it is provide answers, because mainly what I wanted to do is just call attention to three particularly noteworthy such pieces that I encountered during my research, talk a little bit about the swords themselves, showcase some of the damage that I saw, and then just wrap up by speculating a little bit as to some possible explanations that I'd come up with. So I haven't really investigated this in depth yet. So let's dig in, shall we? So the first piece that I'm going to talk about is a ceremonial sword in the National Museum in Copenhagen in Denmark. It's dated to roughly around the turn of the 16th century, circa 1500. The hilt, which is made from walrus ivory and also which is very elaborately carved, as you can see, is designed very much to harken back to a much earlier style of sword hilt, very much the kind of uh, Viking era, early medieval style of hilt. Allegedly, this weapon originated prior to the founding of the National Museum itself, and allegedly it came out of the Danish Royal Art Chamber, which was basically the royal collection of artwork that eventually found its way into the National Museum, or at least parts of it did. So there are 5 instances of damage on this weapon. It's all on the blade, I should say. So as you can see here, I got my diagram sketching out the rough location of all of these damage points. So you have points 1 and 2 towards the upper part of the strong or near the middle, depending on whether or not you divide the blade into 3 parts, weak towards the tip, middle, and then strong towards the hilt, or whether or not you simply divide it into 2, upper half being the weak and bottom half being the strong. And then points 3 to 5 are in the upper part of the middle, more towards the weak. It's also interesting to point out that they're damage to both edges of this sword. So if you go back to the video that I made talking about weapons damage, particularly to swords, you'll see some of the investigation that I did on this with other weapons, using some of this, the existence of damage to both edges in certain circumstances, to be able to make a solid case for the use of both the true and the false edge on these weapons. That is to say, both edges for slightly different purposes. So possibly that's what we're seeing here. But again, not having a designated true and false edge, it's not really possible to make that call with much certainty. The next sword comes from the famous Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and it is the ceremonial sword of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. It's reckoned to be of northern Italian make and dated to circa 1433. So this was to commemorate Emperor Sigismund's participation in the formation of the Order of the Dragon, which is also sometimes referred to as the Dragon Sword, mainly because of the very, very ornate quillins, gilt and made in the form of a swirling dragon. As Sigismund founded the Order of the Dragon in 1408, so it's something that was ever since very strongly associated with him. Now here we see 2 instances of damage, again one on each edge, and each of these points, one of them is based more towards the strong, the lower portion, and the other towards the weak, the upper portion. And finally, we have from the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, the sword of the Constable of France. So this, in its current form, is dated to around 1480. As you can see, the blade has quite a lot of gilt decoration with gilt fleur-de-lis. The guard is designed very much to reflect an earlier 14th century style of guard. Again, possibly that sense of reverence of the antique, which was very common for ceremonial purposes, and to an extent still is. So the sword of the Constable of France has no fewer than 12 instances of damage. It could, for all I know, have more, because when I was examining this piece, I was being very conservative as far as what I ranked as damage from use, as opposed to possible damage from just having been occasionally banged about a bit in the course of its life, maybe put on rough shelves, maybe mishandled at one point or another. So I was able to limit that down to 12 instances that I was confident were much more likely to be from actual use as opposed to neglect. Again, we have damage spread throughout both edges, and the damage are concentrated throughout both the weak and the strong of the blade. So what on earth is all of this damage doing on swords that are supposed to be purely for ceremonial purposes? Well, the short answer is, at the moment, we don't know. However, I have a few possible theories, one of which is simply that what we're seeing is the result of, shall we say, less careful or less reverent collectors in these weapons throughout their lives. So it is not impossible that even though these were very precious objects that were probably kept well looked after and brought out for state functions, it's not impossible that at one point or another someone in charge of it, or someone who was the official caretaker or owner of it, might have taken it out for a bit of a bash about, even if it wasn't necessarily supposed to be. In the space of many, many centuries, we can't rule that out, especially in the last, say, 200 to 300 years, where we have plenty of other known cases of 18th and 19th century collectors and caretakers of objects being a lot more cavalier with them than we would be today. So that's perhaps the kind of simplest and least elegant explanation for this. The other explanation is that it's possible that what we are dealing with here are ceremonial weapons where its current configuration was assembled for ceremonial purposes, but that the blade may have actually had a separate previous working life. In other words, that what we're seeing here could be recycled blades from weapons that were functional and intended for use, and indeed were used, being repurposed at some point later for the construction of a ceremonial weapon. Now, why would you do this? Well, there's a couple possible reasons for this. One is simply waste not, want not. We have plenty of cases of weapons or armors or pieces of either being repurposed or recycled into later weapons or later objects further along the line in their working lives. A fantastic example of this are funerary achievements, funerary armors. Some of the more well-known ones you see, for example, as the armor and weapons of, say, the Black Prince in Canterbury Cathedral, or of Henry V in Westminster Abbey. We don't know for absolute certainty that these armors, which have these weapons which have long been associated with them, were in fact the personal possessions of these people, or possibly could have been surplus weapons and surplus objects in the general possession, whether of the royal wardrobe or other persons, that were simply made use of for the purpose of creating funerary achievements to be hung for these. And the same can be said that we know for other funerary armors. We have quite a number of cases of funerary helms later in the 16th and in the 17th century in churches, particularly in England, where we have it on record that the helmet that's over a person's tomb never actually belonged to them. It was simply acquired for the purpose of hanging as a monument. So it's possible that what we're seeing here is a blade that was made use of for the construction of a ceremonial weapon, just because it happened to be lying around and it was more or less the right dimensions, and waste not, want not. The other possibility is that the selection of these blades for being reused onto these weapons could have been much more intentional and significant than we think. It is possible that these blades had some kind of provenance, which was known at the time and is now lost to us, that made it a much more desirable choice to have mounted in a ceremonial weapon. This could have been a blade that belonged to some significant person that this merited commemoration. It could have been a blade that was used in some particularly significant or auspicious event that this was meant to commemorate. So there's any number of reasons why there's something special about that blade, that it was a deliberate choice to use that, to put onto this, to give it new life, if you will, as a ceremonial object. And that, unfortunately, for at least these weapons, any knowledge of what that possible significance was has now been lost to us over the centuries. So, as I said, this video raises much more questions than it answers, but what I hope it does is kind of open up a new way of looking at these ceremonial weapons as they're typically referred to in museums and collections around the world. I know for myself, I want to take a much closer look at quite a number more of these ceremonial swords to see if I can see the same pattern exist in these. And you, my beloved viewers, I encourage you to do the same. If you encounter and have access to a ceremonial sword that you can take a look at, and you see some of these things, and if you want to look at a way of documenting the damage or categorizing it using the method that I did, you can watch my previous video on damage to weapons, and I lay all that out for you. And so if you find anything, please let me know. I'd love to hear about it, because the more information that I can gather about this, the more I can start to put together better theories and investigate them in more depth. So please, if you find anything new along these lines, sound off and let me know, because it'd be really cool to hear from you. So I'm going to end things there for now. If I uncover anything new and interesting in this line of research, I'll make another video and keep everybody updated. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you see here, you can subscribe to me on YouTube, or indeed subscribe to my Patreon page, throw a few coppers into the hat so that I can keep doing what I'm doing here. You can also find more information on my training if you want to learn the sword with me, or some of my other research on my website, schoolofmars.com, or again on my Patreon page, patreon.com/schoolofmars. And thank you again for your attention. I'll see you next time.